All right, so we're going to go here to share screen. And we're going to go to the Theory of Evolution lecture. Let me pull it up here. All right, here we go. All right, so let's talk a little bit about how the theory was developed. So in this lecture, we will go through the 5 disciplines that influenced Charles Darwin when developing his theory of evolution via natural selection. And there was also another scientist, another theorist by the name of Alfred Russel Wallace, who also somewhat at the same time came up with the same theories, but he didn't publish his ideas, his concepts first. So Darwin ended up gaining credit for the theory, but we'll talk about that later on here in this lecture. So you may have heard of the Galapagos finches. The Galapagos finches are very famous for demonstrating to Darwin that these finches likely were descendants from a common ancestor. Since these finches all looked very similar, however, they filled very specific adaptive roles. So these finches look similar, but they also had distinctive variations. So they had variations in their colors, they had variations in the shape and the thickness of their beaks, they had differences in the pitch and tone of their songs, they had differences in the habitats that they frequented, the resources that they exploited. So even though they were similar, they had distinct differences and they fulfilled very specific roles within their environment, which when you think about it, that's extremely adaptive. Let's say we were all in the classroom and I brought in 15 Snicker bars and there's 25 of us. So we'd all be competing over those 15 Snicker bars. But if I brought in 5 Snicker bars and 5 Butterfingers and 5 Milky Ways and 5 Almond Joys and 5 Kit Kats, you guys get the picture. If I brought in plenty of candy bars for everyone with lots of variety, there would be far less competition because we would each be able to consume the candy bar that we wanted. Now, obviously, that's a very simple example, but I like to use that example because it helps understand the finches. If some finches are eating nectar and some finches are eating seeds and some finches are eating insects and some are eating flowers from cacti, it's actually benefiting all of them because that means that all of these species are not in direct competition with one another and they're all able to survive and reproduce more successfully. And there's not as many examples as finches not being able to get enough food for survival. However, if all of these finches are all trying to eat seeds, or they're all trying to eat nectar from flowers, or they're all trying to eat insects, then it may be more likely, if the environment is fully saturated, if there's lots of organisms trying to eat the same food, then it's far more likely that they're going to compete. And it's far more likely that some of those organisms may not be able to compete successfully. So the ideas of natural selection basically states that some organisms will inevitably possess the characteristics that make them more likely to survive. And those organisms that possess those characteristics will be far more likely to survive. And if they're far more likely to survive, then they'll be far more likely to reproduce. So natural selection is based on the concept that individuals with preferential characteristics will survive and reproduce at a higher rate in comparison to individuals that do not possess these traits. So Darwin developed the theory of descent with modification, or what we know today as the theory of evolution. So it's very important to keep in mind, and this is a very common misconception with the theory of evolution and with natural selection. So it's okay if you had this misconception, it's very common. Survival of the fittest does not necessarily mean the survival of the strongest or the most aggressive or the biggest or the most alpha. That's not necessarily how natural selection works. Certainly sometimes if the environment calls for it, certainly the strongest or the biggest or the most aggressive might survive. But that's a common misconception with human evolution, especially because there was a lot of, especially in the 1960s and 1970s, there was a lot of thought that humans evolved to be aggressive, because there's a lot of evidence that friendliness and altruism was just as strong, if not stronger, in our evolutionary past. And we'll explore that in more and more detail as we move on through the class. But just keep in mind, when we're talking natural selection, survival of the fittest doesn't necessarily mean survival of the strongest, nor the most intelligent, but the ones most responsive to change. So you probably get sick of me hearing this, or sick of me saying this, but a good way to think about it is in the game of evolution, diversity will always win. If you have a diverse gene pool, that means if the environment fluctuates, if all of a sudden there's some sort of environmental catastrophe or global climate change or a volcanic eruption or a major earthquake, if there's an environmental change, if the gene pool is diverse and organisms have a wide variety of characteristics and strategies for survival, it's far more likely that that species will survive. But if that gene pool is shallow, if there's not a whole lot of variation, then it's far more likely that that species may die out if there's some sort of cataclysmic event. All right, so some vocab words to get out of the way here. So adaptation. So adaptation would be a change or changes in the physical structure, function, or behavior that allows an organism or a species to survive and reproduce in a given environment. So we'll say that again because it's so important. An adaptation would be a change in physical structure, function, or behavior that allows an organism or species to survive and reproduce in a given environment. So it could be a change in the beak shape, beak size, beak robusticity or thickness, the color of the finch, the song of the finch, the behavior of the finch. You guys get the picture. So it's any change that would allow the organism to more successfully survive and reproduce in a given environment. Now, of course, you may have heard of some behaviors or physical features that are maladaptive or essentially detrimental to the organism. And that does happen sometimes, and we'll talk about some of those, but an adaptation is a change in the positive way that makes the organism more able, more capable of survival. All right, so related to adaptation would be adaptive radiation. So adaptive radiation is a diversification of an ancestral group of organisms into new forms that are adapted to specific environmental roles or niches. So that word niche or niche simply means role within the environment. So like the Snicker bar example, if some of us are really specifically adapted to eating Snicker bars, and some of us are really adapted to eating Almond Joys, and some of us are really adapted towards eating Milky Ways, and some of us are really adapted towards eating Butterfingers, that means that we're filling that role in the environment, that's our resource, that's the food source that we're going after. That's what we compete for with others that like Snicker bars or others that like Butterfingers. You guys get the picture. But we're not competing with everybody that likes candy bars. We're just competing with those that like our type of candy bar. So you can apply that to the finches. So in this picture here on this slide, we've got the founder species or the parental species all the way down here at the bottom. And then you see all of these branches. So I've mentioned in previous lectures, we need to start thinking of evolution in terms of messy branching events, not in a linear fashion. Evolution doesn't work that way. Evolution is messy and bushy. So every single branch, every twig on the tree is going to represent a speciation event or a new species. So these finches share a common ancestor. They have a parental species and a common ancestor that is down here at the base or the root of the tree, you could say. And then as time went on, as the finches migrated to the various islands, as they started adapting to the circumstances that existed on those islands, they started to speciate. They started to form these distinct species. Some finches have this reddish color, some are yellow-greenish, some are completely yellow. Some have really long skinny beaks that almost are like a straw that allows them to suck nectar from a flower. Some of them have really short, stout, robust beaks that allow them to crush seeds. Some of them have beaks that are kind of in between that allow them to eat insects and seeds. And some are, everywhere in between. So these very distinctive species have adaptively radiated out. They have modified over time. They've modified their physical structure and their behavior to make them more likely to survive in a specific environment. So what's beneficial in one environment may not be beneficial in another. That's very important to remember. All right, so Darwin viewed evolution as simple biological change from generation to generation. Darwin's theories on evolution, especially at the time, and I would argue even today, were considered quite controversial due to the predominant religious doctrine of the time. So Darwin particularly faced backlash and controversy regarding evolution of humans. The reason for that is essentially that humans, I'd argue even today, humans tend to think of themselves as superior or better than the rest of the animal kingdom, that we're somehow removed or not subject to the same ecological laws of other animals, which is quite simply not the case. We certainly, we're a very adaptable species. We've adapted to every circumstance on the planet. I'm not saying humans aren't cool. We're very cool. But we are subject to the same environment that everyone else is, that every other species is. Essentially we have, in my humble opinion, we have certainly exceeded the carrying capacity of our environment. So that's why we're starting to experience a lot of competition. That's why we have people that are starving to death without enough food to eat. That's why we have people without homes or enough territory to live in. And unfortunately, this problem will only increase as human population size continues to increase, as global climate change continues to reduce the amount of usable land that we have. So it's something to keep in mind that, it may be to our benefit in evolutionary terms to start being more respectful to our environment. But again, just my humble opinion. But it's important to note that, of course, Darwin, he faced backlash, and I would argue that even maybe some backlash today on the theory of evolution simply because of the time frame. So because evolution takes time, evolution takes hundreds, thousands, millions of years in many cases. And this certainly is in contrary to what some of the religious doctrine claims. The religious doctrine claims that the earth is thousands of years old rather than millions or billions. But I really want to encourage everyone, I always say it at this point in the lecture, you don't necessarily need to abandon a belief in a creator or your spirituality to learn about the theory of evolution or even support the theory of evolution. You just have to have an open mind about the time frame of the earth. It's certainly possible that the time frames listed and described in religious texts are merely hypothetical, or maybe they're based on more recent past and not trying to claim that that's the history of the earth in its completeness. It's certainly possible that a common ancestor was created by a creator, that a creator made that common ancestor, and then evolution occurred from there. It's possible that our creator intended evolution or designed evolution. So there's many ways you can think about it. You don't necessarily have to abandon your religion just to take this class. All you have to do is have an open mind and be willing to learn about it. Questions so far? Comments? Thoughts? We're good? Okay.
Yeah.
Yes. Question, comment.
Yeah. In regards to religion, like I think
Yes.
that's just my personal opinion. I just think that from in the book of Genesis, I think that that's like a summary, maybe the first third of Genesis. It's more like a summary. It's not really trying to accurately account for a time period. However, I think scholars and people who study the Bible alike tend to make it more of like this 10,000 year span. And I really think that the beginning is just like a summary of time. It's just my opinion. And then it kind of breaks down once you get to Abraham. It's just my opinion.
Yeah,
I want,
Lorena,
I want,
that's a really good way to look at it. Yeah, that's
yeah,
a really open-minded, good way to look at it, and a good way of, also being able to, kind of take in other people's opinions and really be able to have an open mind. So I really appreciate that. That's a good way to look at it.
thank you.
Any other thoughts, comments? We're good? Okay. All right, so Alfred Russel Wallace. So he's the gentleman that also essentially co-authored, I should say, at least in my opinion, he should get co-authoring credit. So he co-authored this theory of evolution via natural selection. Alfred Russel Wallace contacted Darwin in 1858 with a set of ideas very similar to those of Darwin. Both men independently talked about evolution via natural selection. And of course, Darwin was concerned that Wallace would gain credit for the idea. But in my opinion, what they should have done is co-authored on the origin of species, because in my opinion, and this is probably my anthropological training, but 2 minds are better than 1 and 3 minds are better than 2. So it's, the more scientific minds you can put together and create these hypotheses and develop these theories, it's the better it's going to be. So both men independently talked about evolution via natural selection, but Darwin gained credit for it simply because he published first. So even though he was nervous about publishing on the origin of species, he eventually was convinced to do so. And Alfred Russel Wallace was probably one of the main reasons. So you could also credit Wallace for, giving Darwin that extra little push, that extra little motivation to go ahead and publish his ideas. Because you could imagine if he never did, I mean, I'm sure someone else would have come up with this theory, this hypothesis, I should say, at that point in time. But I think we would certainly be missing out on some important insight if we were missing Darwin's studies on the Galapagos finches. All right, so some important things to keep in mind with evolution. There's a lot of misconceptions. So this slide here kind of helps, dispel some of those misconceptions. So evolution can happen in various ways. Evolution, like I mentioned before, can sometimes take hundreds, thousands, millions of generations, but sometimes it can occur more rapidly. If you're looking at a smaller population size, I'm going to show you an example here in a moment of the rock pocket mouse. If you're looking at a smaller population that has a mutation, and that mutation provides a huge benefit to those organisms, then you may see evolution happen over 10 generations instead of over 100. So evolution may occur gradually over time. We call that phyletic gradualism, or it may happen much more rapidly with speciation events. We call that punctuated equilibrium. So again, the environment is a big influencer. If the environment changes rapidly or suddenly, then organisms are forced to either adapt or die out. So if the environment changes rapidly, you may see evolutionary change happening more rapidly. But if the environment is relatively steady, relatively constant, then evolutionary change may also be very gradual. This is another huge misconception. I get the question all the time, well, if humans evolved from chimpanzees or bonobos, then why are there still chimpanzees and bonobos? That's kind of a misconception of how evolution works. So humans share a common ancestor with the chimpanzees and other primates. However, humans did not evolve from chimpanzees. So again, we want to get away from that idea that evolution happened in a line with chimps over here, humans all the way over here. We want to start thinking of evolution as a tree or a braided delta. So at the base of the tree, you have that common ancestor, and then every branch, every twig shooting off in different directions is representing adaptive radiation and speciation events. So in the case of humans and our closest living relatives, the other great apes, our closest relatives are the chimps and bonobos, but gorillas and orangutans are also pretty closely related, genetically speaking. We separated from the other apes about 5 to 7 million years ago. And with increased accuracy, we know it's probably a little bit closer to 7 million years ago. But think about 7 million years ago, there was a split. There was a split, and pong'ids, the other apes, chimps, bonobos, orangutans, and gorillas, went off this way in the evolutionary branch. And then humans and our ancestors, the hominins, went off in this direction. So we split off, and even 7 million years later, we still share about 98% of our DNA. And we still have some behavioral similarities, some anatomical similarities, but also some differences, of course, that we'll delve into in detail in this course. But just know for now, kind of try to erase that image of the chimp over here on this end and the human over here on this end, because that image, that famous image of evolution, has created a lot of misconceptions. So we did not evolve from chimpanzees, but we share a common ancestor with chimpanzees. Another common misconception, the theory of evolution is often disregarded due to the term theory. So, and I even catch myself doing this sometimes. Sometimes when you're talking with a group of friends or, in a casual setting, you may say, well, I have this theory about this. And really what you mean is I have an idea about this or a hypothesis about this. And, we get in the habit of saying I have this theory. And that's fine. It's just important to remember that if we're talking about a scientific theory, if it gets the title of scientific theory, it means that it's gone through rigorous testing using the scientific method, and not just by one scientist, by many scientists using that same technique. And it's been proven to be supported in all instances. There's no, substantial substantial evidence to the contrary if it's been given the title of scientific theory. Okay, so it's just important to remember that in order to get the title of theory, it's gone through rigorous testing and it is proven to be supported. So it's just, I think it's a, common misconception that it's when you hear the term theory, you think, oh, that's just one scientist's idea or maybe a couple scientists' ideas. But at least in the scientific community, the only thing with more clout or more validity would be a scientific law. So it's just, we have to give credit to, something that gets the title of a theory. All right, so what is evolution essentially? So evolution can be defined as fluctuations in gene frequencies from generation to generation. And we will in detail learn how to calculate this and also to use Punnett squares and the Hardy-Weinberg. That'll be coming up in chapter 3 and chapter 4. But don't let the word calculations scare you guys away, I promise. They're going to be simple calculations, and it's actually really easy to use. So it is actually very possible, if you're looking at characteristics that we understand their genetic components, and we understand how they're passed down from generation to generation, we can sometimes calculate the likelihood that some characteristics will be passed along into future generations. And we can also study populations and see if those genotypic frequencies are changing. So if we can see that they're changing, and especially if they're changing in a specific direction, then we know that they may be responding to an environmental force, to some sort of environmental circumstance that's providing an advantage to one trait or another. So the term gene frequency refers to the number of genes in a population that exists for each form of a trait. For example, in humans, we have 4 different blood types. You could be blood type A, blood type B, blood type AB, or blood type O. Or in humans, we also have a monohybrid trait of our earlobes. Our earlobes are either free hanging, meaning that the lobes are not attached to the jawline, or they may be attached. Another monohybrid trait is whether or not we have a widow's peak or a straight hairline. Another one is whether or not we have a hitchhiker's thumb or a straight thumb. Another one is whether or not we can taste the chemical PTC. There's some other chemicals too that are monohybrid. So there's the chemical NPROP and thyroid, and another one that starts with a T that I'm forgetting right now. But you guys get the point. There are some characteristics within humans that we can calculate using specific formulas and Punnett squares. And we will learn how to do that in chapter 3 and 4. So a selective advantage exists if a trait is beneficial to the individual in a given environment. That means it is more likely to become common within the population. And I'm going to give you guys a video example here in a second. So for example, we have 2 different forms of a mouse. We have a mouse that has a kind of brownish, sandy colored fur, and then we have a mouse that has a dark gray, black fur color. And the dark gray black fur color only exists because there was a mutation. There was a random change in the genetic material that coded for dark black fur instead of brown fur. Now, when the mice are trying to exist in the Southwest desert, on a sandy desert, you can imagine if you're a little tiny mouse and you're trying to avoid a hawk or an eagle. So this aerial predator's way up here looking down at the sandy desert. So if your fur is brown in color, then you're going to be much more likely to avoid that aerial predator. You're going to blend into the sand. But if you have black fur and your substrate, you're trying to hide in the sandy desert, you're going to be far more likely to be scooped up by that hawk or that eagle because he's going to see you sticking out like a sore thumb. But there was a shift in the environment. There was a volcanic eruption that covered the substrate in lava. And once that lava dries, it's kind of dark gray, blackish in color. So all of a sudden it flipped. All of a sudden, if you have the black colored fur, you're much more able to blend in with the environment. You're much more likely to avoid that hawk or eagle. And if you have the sandy brown color, you're much more likely to stick out. You're much more likely to get eaten by that hawk or eagle. So I'm going to show you a video clip here, and I want you to really think about how this might work. Think about how mutation might create this variation in the gene pool. So in order for natural selection to work, there must be variation in the gene pool. And the selective advantage is determined by the environment. So when the environment was the sandy brown color, the brown mouse had the advantage. And then when it shifted, when it's the black color, all of a sudden the black mouse has the advantage. So think about this, how this might work, and think about if you can think of any, if you can determine any other examples that might exist in the animal kingdom. So let's go ahead and watch this clip. So throughout the class, there's some clips that I'm going to show you. Not all of them are HHMI, but HHMI has some really good clips that help us really understand some of these concepts. So HHMI is Howard Hughes Medical Institute. Pull the clip up. So I'm going to show you several of these that help demonstrate these processes and make them more easy to understand. Okay, so I'm going to play it, and I did remember what I shared. I did optimize for sound, but you guys tell me. Oh, hold on. Let me make sure the volume is up. You guys tell me if anything is too soft or too loud. Check where the volume is. All right. Is it sounding okay?
Yes.
Perfect.
Yes.
All right, so let's watch this and we'll talk about it. Oh, not pause.
Across the American Southwest, golden deserts dotted by cacti and brush stretch for miles. Yet here in New Mexico's Valley of Fire, the landscape changes dramatically. Patches of black rock interrupt the sand, remnants of volcanic eruptions that occurred about 1,000 years ago. The eruptions spewed a river of lava more than 40 miles long across the desert. As the molten rock cooled, it darkened, leaving any creature dependent upon camouflage in serious trouble. In the complex battle of life, one of the constant struggles is between seeing and not being seen, the evolutionary game of hide and seek. And we've come here to the Valley of Fire in New Mexico, a battlefield, to find one of the tiniest soldiers and what it can teach us about how evolution works. On the desert sands, the rock pocket mouse blends in perfectly, its light-colored fur concealing it from predators. But on dark lava, the same fur makes the mouse stand out, attracting the many creatures that see it as food.
These mice are the Snickers bar of the desert. They're eaten by foxes and coyotes and rattlesnakes, and certainly by owls, and maybe even occasionally hawks. And most of those predators are visual predators.
So what happened to the pocket mice that found themselves on this new terrain? When I accompany biologist Michael Nachman onto the lava, it doesn't take long to find out.
Oh, this one's closed.
Nachman has been collecting mice unharmed in traps. And it's a dark one.
It is, yeah.
Now, are most of the ones you find up here dark?
Almost all of them.
Not only have the mice here evolved to be as dark as the rock,
Shake them into the bag.
the color change has occurred precisely where it will conceal them from hunters. Now, a bit of a white underbelly, too.
That's right. All of the dark ones here and on other lava flows have a white underbelly, and presumably there's no selection for dark on the belly because predators are coming from above.
Left to themselves, the mice show no preference for light or dark rocks. It's the predators that have made the difference.
The change in color over evolutionary time in the population is driven by predators weeding out the mice that don't match their background.
But how did the dark mice arise in the first place?
When a black mouse appears in a light population of mice, that is usually going to be due to a new mutation, and those are random and rare events.
To fully understand the pocket mouse transformation, Nachman moves from the lava to the lab. He and his team extract DNA from light and dark mice taken from one desert region. The aim? To find one or more genetic mutations that cause dark coloration. A mutation is a change in the chemical letters that make up our genes. It's a copying error that may occur when our cells divide. Mutation seems to mean that something bad has happened. Well, mutations are neither good or bad. Whether they are favored or whether they are rejected or whether they're just neutral depends upon the conditions an organism finds itself. So for the pocket mouse, a mutation that caused the mouse to turn black, that is good if you're living on black rock. It's bad if you're living out in the sandy desert.
The light mice are all on the bottom, here, here.
Fur color is a trait controlled by many genes. To figure out how dark mice evolved, Nachman focuses on how these genes differ in dark and light mice. One by one, the genes prove identical, but at last, something does turn up. The difference between dark and light mice boils down to a difference of 4 chemical letters in a gene called MC1R. Because the gene controls the amount of dark pigment in a mouse's hair follicles, a mouse with these mutations grows dark fur, which gives it an advantage on a dark background. But still, that's one mouse. How would its dark fur spread to a whole population?
This lava flow is about 1,000 years old. And so you might wonder, has there been enough time? It's only been 1,000 years. It's a very short period of time for a new mutation to come along and spread, and so that all of the mice on this lava flow are black, because really they all are.
Indeed, such a rapid spread of a mutation may seem unlikely until you do the math. And the reason is that while only one new mouse born in 100,000 may be black, hundreds of thousands of mice are born in any given year. And then those mice that are black have enough advantage that their babies do better, and they have more offspring, and their offspring have more offspring. And just about a 5% advantage, compounded year in and year out, can very quickly turn the whole population black, as we see today. If dark color gives mice a 1% competitive advantage, and you start with 1% of the population being dark, then about 1,000 years, 95% of the mice will be dark. If instead, the dark color gives them a 10% advantage, then it only takes 100 years. Thanks to Nachman's mice, science has an example of evolution crystal clear in every detail.
What's exciting about this is that we have a system that's very simple ecologically. You have dark rocks and you have light rocks, and you have dark mice and light mice. It couldn't be simpler.
We know who the predators are, what the selective force is. We know precisely the genetic basis of what makes the mice have an advantage or a disadvantage depending upon where they live. All the pieces are finally together. It's a perfect illustration of Darwin's process of natural selection. In fact, it's more than that. For Nachman's mice also counter a common misconception that evolution is a random process. Well, there is one random component, and that's the process of mutation. Mutations occur at random throughout our DNA. Every new organism is born with a new set of mutations. But while mutation is random, natural selection is not. Natural selection sorts out the winners and losers, and that's really what the whole process of evolution is driven by. But if natural selection is not random, would it produce the same result under the same conditions? It does. And here's proof. Rock pocket mice collected by Nachman from other lava flows in other parts of the Southwest.
These are 2 different black mice, and they each evolved on different lava flows, and the lava flows are hundreds of miles apart, but the changes, the genetic changes that made these mice black were different in each case. And what's amazing to me is how similar the black mice are. We didn't know when we started this whether we would find that there were the same genes or different genes, and we were really surprised to find that they were completely different genes, and yet if you look at the mice, they look almost identical.
Clearly, there are different genetic ways to make a mouse dark. But once the beneficial mutations appear, natural selection, the non-random part of evolution, can, under very similar conditions, favor very similar adaptations.
In effect, each of these lava flows is like rewinding the tape of life and allowing evolution to occur again and again. And in each case, we find the dark mice have evolved.
The rock pocket mice show us that evolution can and does repeat itself, and why evolutionary change is never ending. As environments transform, so must the species that inhabit them, adapting and readapting in the great and complex battle of life.
All right, so I really like that clip because I feel like it does a pretty nice job of demonstrating two of the forces of evolution. It talks about mutation and natural selection, and we'll learn about those both in more detail in the upcoming chapters, but it really kind of demonstrates in a simple way how evolutionary change can happen, especially if that mutation creates a huge selective advantage like it did in this case. That MC1R mutation created a huge selective advantage once the environment was now black in color. The black colored mouse now blended in with the environment much more effectively than the brown colored mouse. So if the selective advantage provides, a 10% advantage, it's not going to change the mice population as fast as it would if the selective advantage was 20% or 30% or 50%, for example. So the greater the selective advantage, the higher potential it has to influence evolutionary change within that population. So it has a higher likelihood of influencing the survivability of various organisms. So some important takeaways from that I noticed. So it's important to remember that evolution is not necessarily random. Mutations are random. Mutations happen randomly, but what is not random is the advantage, the selective advantage, the component of natural selection. So while evolution is not random, while mutation is random, natural selection is not. And if the mutation provides a larger selective advantage, then it has the potential to change the population more quickly, to change the genetic component of that population more quickly. And as environments transform, so must the species that inhabit them, is an important quote from that. So as the environment transforms, so must the species that inhabit them if they want to survive, essentially. Do you guys have any questions about what you saw there?
Not necessarily what I saw there, but I do have a question.
Sure, go right ahead.
How long will we be covering evolution? Just for this week, or will it be next week? Or
so we go through, so this chapter is on the theory of evolution, how it was developed. And then chapter 3, we're going to go into some of the biological processes that are important to understand in order to understand how evolution works. So we'll learn about DNA replication. We'll learn about mitosis and meiosis, which is the formation of our somatic cells and our gametes. So our somatic cells are our body cells. So anything that makes up our tissues, our blood cells, our organ cells, our bone cells. And then the formation of gametes is the formation of our sex cells, so sperm cells and egg cells. And that's important for evolution because it creates genetic diversity. And sexual recombination, the combination, once these sperm and egg cells combine, we get genetically distinct organisms. So even if, for example, the same mother and the same father have the capacity of creating over a million different unique gametes. So, that's why even if you have the same mother and father as your siblings, you may still look very different from them. So that's chapter 3. And then chapter 4 goes into, we'll do some Punnett squares and some Hardy-Weinberg problems that allow us to, once we understand what a gene is and how it's inherited, we'll learn there are some ways of calculating the probability of passing that along to your offspring, for example. So unit 1 really delves pretty deeply into the process of evolution and how to understand evolution. And then, we'll continue to come back to it throughout the semester, but unit 1 is really the one that focuses in the most on the process of evolution. Does that answer your question?
Yes. Will you also have some really cool videos for like the human process, like you have for the mice?
Yes, yeah, we have in chapter 4, there's a video that I show on the sickle cell anemia case. I also have some videos on human evolution, of course. I've got some great videos on primate evolution that are going to be really, I like to, kind of mix it up a little bit for you guys. I try to find as many cool video clips as I can that help demonstrate these concepts.
Yeah, I'm just really interested in seeing how, as humans migrated out of Africa, and how that dynamic changed in terms of evolution, and where does Neanderthal fit into all that. So I'm really interested to find out about that.
Yes, Unit 3 is all about that. Unit 3, we're going to start 6 million years ago with the very first hominin ancestor, and then we're going to work our way through the last 6 million years. And we'll look at the migration out of Africa and how Homo sapiens interacted with other species. We'll look at how Homo erectus migrated out of Africa and where the Neanderthals all fit in. We'll go into that in depth in Unit 3.
Awesome. Great. Thank you.
You're welcome. Good questions. Other questions? All right, so we're at a good time to kind of pause here for a moment. I'm going to go ahead and stop our recording for a bit.